I want to cover now the relationship between two books, our Screwtape Letters and Perelandra. In a previous video, I suggested that actually we can read these books together. C.S. Lewis, for whatever reason, wrote a preface to the Screwtape Letters that combined the character of Dr. Ransom from the science fiction books that we have on the screen here, including an unfinished one, with the Screwtape world. Why he did this, we don't know, but it actually allows us to think in new and fresh ways about how these books are interconnected. I'm going to suggest a few ways that we can read Perelandra with Screwtapian eyes, but I'm going to actually leave a lot of that to you. There are some throwaway things I'll give at the very end, some things for you to pay attention to, but I actually think Perelandra, which is a rich book on its own, and we'll treat on its own, is actually richer when understood with a kind of demonic question in the background, and of course Perelandra has a demonic character. So I think the things fit. Let's take a look at this, right? So here's our 5-pack of trilogy, right? Our 5-part trilogy that we have of the Ransom cycle. And it comes back to that preface where we have Dr. Ransom finding the Screwtape Letters. We've already spent time in Screwtape. We're going to be spending a bit more time in Perelandra. We've looked at Out of the Silent Planet. We've started to think about how these things connect. And one of the things we've already done is look at some of the implications of this Screwtape Ransom universe find. One is language and script. New ideas. This is for the kind of the sci-fi junkies, or the fantasy geeks, to really kind of spend some time honing in on those things. And then those world-building things like cosmology and angelology and anthropology. What does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to be an animal? What does it? How do the planets work together? What's the cosmology? How did the universe begin? All those sorts of things are rethought with regard to this new discovery and bringing those things together. Now, I hope by the end of this lecture, you'll be convinced that we could have done this without the Ransom preface. And this is important. I think the books on their own are begging to be read in a collaborative way. The fact that we have the Ransom preface to Screwtape invites us to combine these speculative worlds. But I think that they're rich even without that particular perspective. All right, now let's look at a couple more Perelandrian kind of examples. And I'm going to do this by looking closely at Chapter 1 and 2 of Perelandra, and I'm going to also look at the Unman very briefly, but a really interesting and problematic character, the Unman Weston. Well, actually, let's actually begin with the Unman, and I don't want to cover his personality totally. I hope you find him a troubling and disturbing character, not merely demonic, but with a tinge of horror. There's a ghastliness to it. There's kind of a hint of zombie literature in Perelandra. It's all there, with the beginnings of the gothic tinge that we're going to see in That Hideous Strength. But the rest of Perelandra is just so bright and green. The old word might be verdant, right? It's a huge garden world of warmth, where even the ocean water is fit to drink, where there is no fear of disease or damage. Indeed, the world is so soft that it would be difficult to kill something out of compassion. So the Unman just sticks out. He just grates on the world of Venus in this story. Well, at one point, of course, right at the beginning of meeting, so remember, Ransom has gone. He's been sent by his friends to Venus, to Perelandra. He meets the Eve of this world, the first queen of this world, and he goes with her to a fixed land, the land where they're forbidden to sleep upon, but of course they're welcome to explore, just to look for the king who's been lost and to satisfy Ransom's curiosity. Then they see a ship fall from heaven. I guess they've seen the ship already, and they go to find out what the thing is that has fallen from heaven. It turns out it's one of Weston's spaceships. Weston emerges from it, and ultimately Ransom is unable to keep the meeting from happening between Weston the eve of Paralandra. And at first, Weston's not interested. Weston's really interested in debating with Ransom about the ideas of life, the universe, and everything, with a very peculiar worldview of scientism, which we need to spend some time thinking about in our discussion groups. This idea of scientism, or this idea in Weston's case that humanity must progress, that we go about kind of populating the worlds with humans as we destroy one world after the other. We see this in The Silent Planet. We just go and conquer another world. Is very much the European project, right? That happened. Europe becomes full. It's war torn. It's poverty stricken, right next to great riches, and so the Europeans begin to go and explore other lands, the Americas, the sub-Saharan Africa, the Saharan Africa space in some cases, and parts of the subequatorial Asia, right? So the southern hemisphere, basically. This is the project. Lewis obviously is critiquing this project, and he then this changes for Weston. The worldview shifts for him a little bit, and for him it's not so much the saving of humanity, but the spreading of the human idea that humans are part of this sort of spiritual realm, a kind of quasi-pantheism, almost like panentheism that we see that comes up later in the century, where God and humanity are working together towards self-growth, towards self-realization, towards self-knowledge. So that's Weston's kind of peculiar worldview comes about. It's shifted for him, and it's become quite real. And at one point, Weston says, "Well, I can give you proof, right, that I've been sent here." And Ransom says, "What proof do you have?" The point in the story had come where they were talking about spirit and the spirit is pouring into me, Weston says, and Ransom challenges, what proof that you're not being guided by your own reading and other people's ideas, right? Or his own brain. Weston's a genius. You didn't know, dear Ransom, says Weston, that I'd improved a bit since we last met in my knowledge of extraterrestrial language. You're a philologist, they tell me. And Ransom is startled. How did you do it? Of course, a philologist would recognize Weston is now a strong speaker of a language that he both refused to speak and was unable to speak in Out of the Silent Planet. And I don't think we have a ton of time. I think we're only supposed to think of this as being 2, 3, 4, 5 years between Out of the Silent Planet and Paralandra. Guidance, croaked Weston. He was squatting at the roots of trees with his knees drawn up and his face, now the color of putty, wore a fixed and even slightly twisted grin. Guidance, he went on. Things coming into my head. I'm being prepared all the time, being made a fit receptacle for it, for this capital S spirit. Well, this is a creepy moment in the text. And I hope as you read, you're reading slowly enough to get that full sense of the horror and the creepiness. And it's not the last time. The ghastly nature of this satanic-infused unman, it happens again and again and again throughout the text. Every moment that there's an opportunity, Lewis turns our minds towards the text and helps us to think about whether this is a man or this is something else. Right? At the beginning he's Weston, and then slowly he becomes the unman, and then slowly the pronouns that are used of it. When ultimately, and if you haven't read the whole book yet, for this lecture you really only need to read the first couple chapters, but you should kind of pause for a second, come back to this. When ultimately the unman is defeated in a certain kind of peculiar way, Ransom, writes of him again as a person, carving on the cave walls, "Here lies the burned body of Edward Rolls Weston," and then gives his biography. And part of actually his memorial in Malacandra is actually that he not only was he a physicist, although he doesn't use that language, but he gave up his will and reason to the bent Eldil. And that's his testimony. He gave up. He surrendered to this. We're going to have to see how this surrender to to the satanic figure, to the Eldil, the angel of Earth, the ruling force of Earth, is got to be contrasted with what people are called to do in giving up their will for Mal-Eldil, or God, within this series. So watch for that contrast. This is, of course, not a terribly Screwtapian particularly moment, but it is certainly a demonic moment. We actually have a character in Lewis's stories that's demonically possessed, and done so seriously within the framework of the world that he's a part of. And as far as I know, no one's ever really critiqued it on that basis. There's other critiques. But no one's ever critiqued it on the basis that we have a walking demonically possessed person within a space opera. And of course, that sounds ridiculous. If it was on the cover like that, that's probably why they put such bad descriptions on the cover that don't make any sense. But but if we just had to say it out loud, what was happening, it would just sound crazy. But for some reason, that kind of works in Perelandra. Critics are less happy with that hideous strength and the way that works, but not because of possession, but because of the other kinds of mishmash of things. Well, this is Lewis. So that's one kind of thing that we notice. Once we start paying attention to Screwtapian, to demonic, to satanic or hellbound kind of links, once we see that, then of course Perelandra and that hideous strength really open up in interesting ways. So let's go to the other point, what I want to call the haunting. And this allows us also to spend some time in the first couple of chapters of Perelandra. I'll be kind of going through them in some detail, not complete detail, and in the other videos that talk about the ransom cycle, I won't be returning to this couple of chapters probably. So, as I left the railway station at Worcester, and of course this is a really interesting thing, and you can check the blog post that I've linked to your resource pack on Schoology, because I wanted to press in, what is this Worcester? And I've kind of decided that I think that this is actually Worcester in Worcestershire. It's a real city, not a fictional one. It's actually one near where Lewis went to school. Both the Lewis brothers went to school in Malvern, in near the village of Great Malvern, which was about half an hour from Worcester Station, where Lewis is getting off here. So I think that's the place, and it actually really fits well the background material of that hideous strength. It's actually in the I encourage you to read that if you have time, and if you know the area, I would love for you to talk about that on the discussion boards. Ransom has a cottage there. Why he's so far from Cambridge, I don't know, but anyway, he has to go down to Cambridge, and Lewis begins the walk to Ransom's house. The flat heath was spread out before me, for village lies all behind to the north of the station, looked like an ordinary heath. The gloomy 5 o'clock sky was such as you might see on any autumn afternoon. The few houses and the clumps of red and yellowish trees were no way remarkable. I mean, this is going to be quite the contrast with Perelandra later. Who could imagine that a little farther on that quiet landscape I should meet and shake the hand of a man who had lived and eaten and drunk in a world 40 million miles distant from London? There's a particular interesting point there. 40 million miles from Earth, I suppose, who had seen this Earth from where it looks like a mere point of green fire, and who had spoken face to face with a creature whose life began before our planet was inhabitable. That's a long question. Okay. And here Lewis links then back to Out of the Silent Planet. Many readers, of course, will just pick up Perelandra and won't have read the first book, which wasn't widely available. And he was not very popular at the time, and so he does this kind of literary linking back in, and we see he doesn't do well at this in Narnia. Other authors are better at linking in their books, particularly fantasy authors who excel in trilogies, find ways of looping in by either summarizing or creating character maps or doing something. Harry Potter, each of the Harry Potter books is pretty good about retelling the story at the beginning and new and kind of creative ways. So in this case, this is Lewis's kind of linking moment here. And as he's going on, his mood is changing. And this is really interesting because Lewis loved taking walks, and Ransom is a walker, and presumably this is Lewis speaking, right? Lewis, the character in his own novel, who's also the narrator of the novel, right? You see the Lewis within the Lewisian work there. He actually calls himself Lewis in the text. He loves walking, and yet he is not enjoying this walk from the train station to Ransom's house. He kept telling himself it'd be delightful to spend an evening with his good friend Ransom, but he was not enjoying it, and he's thrown off by the El Dila. The El Dila are the trouble. I could get used to the fact that Ransom was to Mars, but to meet an El Dil, to have spoken with something whose life appeared to be practically unending. But much worse was my growing conviction that since his return, the El Dila were not leaving him alone. Little things in his conversation, little mannerisms, accidental allusions, which he made and then he drew back with an awkward apology, all suggested he was keeping strange company. And all these visitors were at the cottage where he's going. Right, and this is that intriguing moment I've referenced before, where Lewis says, it's not, when it comes to spiritual things, it's not the same kind of fear as actual danger, falling off a cliff or meeting a wild animal, or being afraid of being mugged in an alley at night. It's a different kind of fear. The idea of meeting something spiritual, that's the shocking kind of moment, and that's an intriguing kind of feature here. But he's also afraid of being drawn in, and this is something Lewis is perpetually afraid of, or his characters keep coming up with this, and Lewis mentioned it himself, is he was always worried about being sucked into something. Okay, but he was also anxious to be part of something. Watch the two characters of Mark and Jane in That Hideous Strength as they actually battle the two parts of his personality that work out, one being afraid of being sucked in to something, one being afraid of not being sucked in, of being left out of something. So here, Ransom's plodding along the empty, unfenced road, which runs across the middle of Worcester Common. I try to dispel my growing sense of malaise by analyzing it. What was I afraid of? And this, of course, this is always a bad. Don't analyze your own soul if you actually don't want to know. I was shocked to find that I mentally used the word afraid. I thought I was pretending to be bored or embarrassed. But no, it was really about fear, and then we start to see in this whole 2 chapters the fear become denser and denser and denser till it finally breaks. I was afraid of meeting an Adil, and I was afraid of being drawn in. And he expects, most people have felt this, that the fear that they might be having to join the Communist Party or the Christian Church, right? Well, he was one of those, right? He had to join the Christian Church. Jean-Paul Sartre at this time, the great existentialist, found that he had to join the Communist Party, even though it seems to go against his point of view. Well, there's all kinds of fear of restriction of freedom and all sorts of things. But the fear of being drawn in, the fear of being part of a cult. My mother was convinced I had joined a cult when as a young man I became a Christian, and she was absolutely terrified for my well-being. Well, we feel that too sometimes. It's like Avon calling or Melaleuca or Amway or whatever the newest kind of scheme is, when someone calls and says, I'd like to introduce you to an idea. Wow, we're worried about being drawn in. That's what Lewis is tapping into. If you haven't actually been taken by anybody yet, if nobody's conned you yet, you may be immune to it for a little bit. And then, so notice the kind of steps that here. He's thinking about these numinous creatures called the Eldil. He forgets his pack on the train, and so he thinks he's going to go back for it, which doesn't make any sense. There's a growing doubt about their own counter-conspiracy. Remember the end of Out of the Silent Planet? They say, well, secretly, everything we said here is actually real. We've put it in a book so it's more palatable, but we're hoping to get it out into the world, and we're basically waging a war against these sorts of men on Earth, these scientists, not scientists, scientism. So these people who are using science for this particular kind of imperialistic worldview of carrying out humanity, but also a war that's happening between the Oyarsa of Earth and the other Oyarsis. So there's that sort of, and he's starting to have doubts about that conspiracy, and then the whole context adds into this moment. A long, dreary road, it's dark night, it's foggy, there's these dead factories with boarded up windows, everything's deep in mists, with houses blacked out from the war, right? right? There's all brown and black blankets on the windows so that if someone comes to bomb, they don't see the one house with light. His own watch stops, which of course is for him, this unrooting from civilization that happens. A copse on my left and some apparently deserted industrial buildings on my right. This is that feeling. He walks by a church, an old chapel. This whole kind of eerie, I used the word gothic before, but this eerie gothic feeling kind of surrounds him. And it's like something bad's going to happen. But then the bad thing that happens is his own doubt and a fear of madness. It's wrong, he says, that people don't know that they're going mad. And it continues, a little empty house by the side of the road with most of the windows boarded up, and one window staring like the eye of a dead fish. He gets this idea of haunting house. Even that first syllable of the word haunted, it would create a shudder in a child who didn't even know what the term was. So he's got this idea of haunted houses. It was dark enough, so he didn't know, due to the fog and trees, how late it was. But the inanimate objects have a facial expression. I remember one time going for a run at nighttime out in the country. We were with a group of kids camping, and I decided to go for a run. I didn't take a flashlight, and within a few, 30 seconds, 45 seconds, I was outside of any light from the camp, and there was no unnatural light, and it wasn't a bright, shiny night. I remember jogging down the road and looking into the woods and seeing dozens of glistening eyes of things watching me. And of course, this is one of the few times I gave up and I ran back. I was terrified. Now, where I live, those aren't like bears or coyotes. Those are foxes who are just trying to steal and eat my shoes, or they're skunks, and you don't want to run into a skunk. You should believe me if you don't know. And so you can kind of see the specter and illusion and terror, all these madness. Look at the language that's used here in this passage. Really, really intriguing, right? This was upon me now. I staggered in the cold and darkness, half convinced that I might be entering madness, but my opinion changes, and then this blacked out, childish, whining thought occurred in my mind. Maybe Ransom's in the yard waiting for him. He's going to jump out from behind. I could see a figure like Ransom standing with his back behind me, and he turns, and there's no human at all. Right? This great setup of terror. And then, of course, embarrassment. I've got no natural wish to enlarge this part of my story, although he already has. This is humiliation. I would have passed by it if I didn't think some account of it was necessary for a full understanding of what follows. You see, Lewis is adding this account because it's an important moment to help us recognize what's taking place in this space. Despite loathing and dismay that pushed me back in a sort of invisible wall of resistance that met me in the face, fighting each step, almost shrieking as a harmless spray of the hedge touched my face, I managed to get through the gate and up the little path. And there I was, drumming on the door and ringing the handle and shouting for him to let me in as if my life depended on it. Right. Okay. What's going on here? Well, when reading this, we just think of, the battle, right? The battle between the Eldils, they'll try and keep you from doing the thing that you need to do. Well, but actually, if we've just read as the Ransom Cycle, Out of the Silent Planet, and then maybe Dark Tower, which is interesting, the Screwtape letters, if we just come from the Screwtape letters to Paralandra, what we have here, we can immediately see it. It's actually not simply a battle between Eldils, but a demonic temptation. Right? And we actually have the parallel to this, the anti-parallel, I guess, is that the right word? The upside-down version of this in Screwtape. The situation's very grave, Screwtape writes to Wormwood, when his patient has had this reconversion experience. A repentance and renewal and grace, this is really bad. This is a defeat of the first order. It amounts to a second conversion. And you have ought to known the asphyxiating cloud which prevented your attacking the patient as walk back from the old mill is a well-known phenomenon. right? So that asphyxiating cloud sounds very much like the invisible wall, but on the other side in Paralandra. It's the enemy's most barbarous weapon and appears when he is directly present to the patient. Okay, so there's, God can protect in that kind of way. But God's not actually doing that in the first couple chapters of Paralandra, which is really interesting. And then Screwtape reams out Wormwood because he allowed the patient to read a book he really enjoyed, and because he enjoyed it, not just to kind of be a smart aleck, he allowed him to go have a nice walk, to have tea, to have solitude in a place he really likes. All these really positive pleasures were given to him. And all of that began to create this space of grace for the recovery of the patient. What we see actually in Paralandra chapter 2 is the clarification of what happened to the Lewis character in chapter 1. You got through without any damage, Ransom asked him. The barrage, you got through the barrage. I don't understand, Lewis says. I was thinking you have met some difficulties in getting here. Oh, that, said I. You mean it wasn't just my nerves? There really was something in the way? Yes, they didn't want you to get here. I was afraid something of the sort might happen, but there was no time to do anything about it. I was pretty sure you'd get through somehow. By the others, do you mean our own Eldilla? Of course, right? And remember what our own Eldilla is. These are demons. These are fallen angels. These are devils. Of course, they've for wind. They've got wind of what's on hand. Right? I interrupted him. To tell you the truth, Ransom, I said, I'm getting more worried every day about the whole business. It came into my head as I was on my way here, ... Oh, they'll put all sorts of things into your head if you let them, said Ransom lightly. The best plan is to take no notice and keep straight on. Don't try to answer them. They like drawing you into an interminable argument. Okay, well, this is really interesting. This is like a demonic temptation. And so we see this kind of anti-Screwtapian moment that takes place here. The great walk, the beautiful opportunity, all the things that Wormwood allowed to happen to the patient in Screwtape letters. Whoever's in charge of this haunting in Paralandra, it didn't allow those to happen. This is not a nice walk. There is no good book. There is no tea. He comes to a cold, empty house with a coffin in the middle of it, although he doesn't know that at the time, right? He's terrified. It's all the opposite stuff, all the pain and none of the pleasure. So in that sense, whoever is in charge of this particular temptation is doing what Screwtape wants. However, notice a couple of differences, and you would want to critique me on this point. In letter 4 of Screwtape, it says, it's funny how mortals always picture us as putting things into their minds when it works better to take things out. So how do we respond to that critique? This actually doesn't sound like Screwtape in some ways. Well, Screwtape is not necessarily the tempter in Paralandra, right? He's already received an administrative post, as we discover in Screwtape Proposes the Toast. He's working as a bureaucrat, and that's what he loves. And so we have a different tactic, perhaps, that's happening in Paralandra, and actually, it actually sounds more like Wormwood, right? Drawing you into an interminable argument sounds like Wormwood. It actually sounds like most demon tempters, unlike Screwtape. Screwtape's kind of responding and setting himself apart from them, and of course, it's like much of Paralandra, isn't it? There's these argument after argument after argument. It's a philosophical novel. And we shouldn't forget, it's very much like Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre, and to a certain extent like Faulkner. These philosophical novels of the period, and George Orwell would be another one, they create a certain kind of discussion or debate. Well, that's what's happening in Paralandra. And so, of course, that's, even though Screwtape says that's not how we operate, that is actually how he does operate. Remember, he chuckles about this atheist that had the particular idea of, the idea that God might be possible in the first chapter of Screwtape letters, right? The idea of God may be possible, right? And then so Screwtape, instead of arguing with him there, actually puts this idea of real life in his mind. So it keeps kind of moving the debate sideways one step. That's how Screwtape argues. And that's actually how the fear-based argument of Paralandra chapter 1 and 2 really went. Reason would suggest that we know by experience what the Eldils are. We know good and evil. We know ransom. We can think this through. But none of that was reasonable at the moment of Perelandra chapter 1 during the haunting. Notice, too, it's a particularly opportune time in the Perelandra story. And so, Weston looks like he's not just demonically possessed, but possessed by the devil himself, like the big dog. And it also looks like, there's an attack on a number of sides against Lewis as he's trying to get to Ransom's cottage in chapter 1. Right? So we have, three answers there. We have it's the anti-Wormwood moment in letter 12 or 13 of Screwtape letters, dark and light, fear versus pleasure, reality versus not reality, etc. It's an opportune time in Perelandra, and there's also, it's still Screwtapian, even though the methods are somewhat different. So that's how I would answer that, but I'd love to hear if you're still unsettled about how to read this. I think, though, as you go through the book of Perelandra, you will find again and again the kind of discussions of Perelandra emerge in this story. Is the philosophy of pleasure that's worked out in Perelandra the same as the Screwtape letters? Both are features of each book. Pleasure is feature of each book. What about the idea of sin? I mean, the word's not really used in Perelandra. It's used a little bit of Screwtape, but as a throwaway word. What about the idea of sin? It's present in both books. Is it the same concept? What is the temptation that Wormwood and Screwtape do, as we see it in Perelandra chapter 1 and 2? How does that contrast, the possession of Weston? How is that different or the same? How is that like Screwtape or different than Screwtape? The unman's temptation of Eve, right? So we have a temptation story. We have Satan tempting Eve. How is that like the temptation of chapter 1 or like the temptations of Screwtape letters? And then what about Ransom's own strengthening and his own guidance? Is Ransom also receiving a spirit, but the spirit of Meldil into him? Certainly there's a voice there. So is Ransom sort of like an anti-Weston in this moment? Is it his own kind of guidance? Interesting. And particularly when you're reading Perelandra, think about the messianic features that we see. This is a typo here, that we see in Ransom. We have demonic or diabolical things in Weston. Do we have Christ things or messianic things in Ransom? Actually, pay attention. You'll actually see some really interesting things. Not to mention, his name, right? Okay, well, this is a bit of an experiment. As always, this is how we roll. This is what we do as readers. This is a kind of fun that we can have. This is not a conspiracy to kind of reprint these books and rebrand them or something. This is simply a case of looking at this part of Lewis's writing life as a whole and seeing what we can learn. Certainly when we get to that hideous strength, the demonic features are clear. But I think people have under-realized the diabolical realities of Perelandra when viewed through a Screwtapian lens. Okay, you may only have started the book of Perelandra when you watch this video, and that's fine. It's now time to finish that entire book and enjoy the teaching and the discussions that have to do with it.